My name is Richard Charles Galway, and I was born in Maryborough, Queensland, at the hospital on the 12th of April 1932. I was a baby of the Great Depression, and my father had been in the tourism industry at Katoomba, and of course in the Depression the tourist industry dried right up. And so the family sought refuge at a family farm up at a place called Didcot, which no longer exists, but was in the Maryborough region. And they had a family farm and a fruit orchard up there. And my first recollection was being in the orchard, sitting down on the ground in the shade of the tree, thinking, what a wonderful life this is. And this was at the age of 2 or 3.
That's your earliest memory.
But that's the earliest memory I have. The second earliest memory was nowhere near so pleasant, because at the farm they had a horse who had the reputation of being a bit of an outlaw, bucking and a bit unsafe. But my older cousin, John Wilby, insisted that I should ride this horse. And I did not want to ride that horse. But against my wild protests and and struggles, I was finally placed in the saddle. The next recollection I had was waking up in bed with a mosquito net over me. I don't know how long later, but obviously it had not gone well.
Yes, okay. So this John Wilby is the one son of your Aunt Mary,
yes,
Alice.
Yes, who was my older cousin, very much respected cousin too. But at that stage, rather a wild youth, and I don't know what possessed him to put me on this horse, but he did.
Well,
he never again referred to the incident.
It was obviously entertaining for him.
Yes, well, I don't remember anything. I was once there, next thing in bed. However, that was the end of it. Nothing further in my recollection except that we were going back to Katoomba, and I can remember a situation in Brisbane Park where presumably we had stopped for lunch. And what I can remember is that Dad was carrying me and complaining about how heavy I was. And from my baby photos, I was indeed a chubby little fellow, despite my appearance today. So that recollection was there. The next recollection I had was of being in a flat in Station Street, Katoomba, which had a nice backyard, and of course it ran alongside the railway line and alongside the main road to Bathurst. And the recollection that I had was that I'd made so much mess in that place in my parents' absence that I didn't want to be around when my parents turned up. So I decided to run away.
Oh.
And the thought was, I'll get to the marked tree. Now, I don't know what I was going to do when I got to the marked tree. There were no further plans. What I did know was that somewhere else was better than where I was. Somehow I negotiated my way across the street, which was Bathurst Road, and I would have only been about 3 at the time, and I was apprehended as I was about to cross the bridge into North Katoomba by an old lady who promptly delivered me back home to face the music. Nevertheless, I was very pleased to be back home, and whatever the punishment was, my mother assures me it was ample. It was still a pleasure to be back home. I have distant memories of that time, but the next thing I know, Dad must have been doing pretty well in business, because then we moved into a cottage in Cascade Street, which was very nice, but only for a short period of time, and finally we wound up in a very nice home in Park Street.
Okay.
I was known to passers-by as Snow. Oh, I didn't tell you that my family nickname, which arose from that interest, was Podge. So as a little boy I was very different from the person I am today, obviously. But it was handy to the school, which was very good, and my Aunt Alice was a teacher there, and initially I was in her class.
Right.
And apparently I did fairly well at that stage, and even at that early stage I showed more promise with arithmetic than anything else. When the others were learning their 4 time tables, I'd already up to 12 times.
Right.
And I think through those years I invariably seemed to finish first or second in the class in the early stages. And then Dad became manager of the Clarendon, a guest house at Katoomba, and that seemed to have been a very profitable business. It was a seasonal business because Katoomba was a great place in summer, but during the winter months it was only for the residents and the hardy. But nevertheless, I enjoyed it. I had a great time there. We lived in the basement, which was very interesting. And we had the whole of the ground floor under, so it was quite a big place to live in. The parents had their quarters. John and I shared a bedroom, and my sister Pat was in the other bedroom. And so that was how we grew up as a family. Pat, being my older sister, often had the job of looking after me. But we nevertheless had a good relationship. And the interesting thing was we did look very much alike. And on one occasion we went to a fancy dress ball and we just swapped clothes. And nobody knew the difference. So we looked very, very similar in those days. John was different, and I guess being nearly 5 years older than it was a bit of a nuisance having a young brother in the house, and he pushed me around and even bullied me a bit, and sometimes used me as a punching bag, so I had to grow up in that. The worst thing about the relationship from my viewpoint was, as I grew older, was that he was a smoker and I was a non-smoker and tested it, and so that was pretty hard. But the good thing about it was that it was very central, very well located. And then something quite surprising happened in the 6th class. A new college had been formed at the back of the guest house, St Bernard's College, which was a Catholic college and was mainly for boarders. And for some reason, I don't know why, my parents sent me there. And so I wound up in a situation where the boarders were there. They were boarders, they were Catholics. I was a day school pupil, and I was Church of England. So I was not so much an outcast with the boys, but I was continually referred to by the teachers along the lines of, look, you fellas have got all these great things for you. Now this outcast here is different and underprivileged compared to you.
Yes. Well, the distinction between C of E and Catholicism
was very bad in
bigger
those days, Chris, and it even persisted in our family. And so we were Anglicans, and we had nothing much to do with the Catholics. So why they sent me to a Catholic school was beyond my comprehension, but it only lasted for a short period of time. Because midway through sixth class, I was sent as a boarder to King's School, and the place that we resided at was the old government house, which had, of course, a great history associated with it. But again, that was a bit of a shock to the system. But first of all, it was a great place to be. Somehow there were 12 of us in a dormitory, and there were other dormitories as well. When I went back and looked at the place as an adult, I looked at it and said, how did they ever get 12 students in bed in that room? And the common room, how did they get all those, probably about 40 to 50 boys in there? How did they get them all there?
Yeah.
So there were quite a few things about it.
Well, I went there, visited there a year or so ago, and I'm struggling to...
You can't imagine it. The grounds were beautiful.
A boarding house.
There was plenty of grounds. But I was what they termed a fresher, which was about the worst status. Everybody was a fresher in the first year, but I had it worse because I came in halfway through the year, so the others were used to it, but I was a one-off and had to be reduced to this state of being a fresher.
Must have been better than being an Anglican in a Catholic school.
No, I don't think so, actually. But the first month in particular was really tough because I was dumped there, and I didn't know it, but my parents were told under no circumstances will you see him in that first month. And I was just so miserable with this fresher status. And I used to sort of stand watching the trains going up under the mountains and thinking, oh, I wish I was on that train. But of course, both those experiences, whilst they were tough, also build character. They build resilience. And I did have a comforting thing, was the person in charge of the preliminary boys' college was a Christian, and he was a marvellous person. He became a second father to me. There was another teacher there who was a bit of a chess player. I played chess, and that was a rarity for a boy, so I did have a couple of good contacts there. But that was just for sixth class. But sort of thinking back of it, both my brother and sister also went to boarding schools in Sydney, John to King's and Pat to Merredin, and somehow that must have been a tremendous sacrifice for my parents. You know, from your own experience, what it's like to have a person at one of these schools and a boarder to boot, and yet they had three of us there. So they made a great sacrifice. I came home on holidays, of course. That was good. And at the end of primary school, I went back into the high classes of high school, first and second year, and I didn't handle that at all well. It was quite a transition. a different form of teaching, and obviously I didn't do too well at it. In fact, I found much more pleasure playing football and cricket and and the sort of life that you have there. Friendship with other lads was pretty good, but even in first year, again, you went through this fresher status there too, in a different place. But the end result of that was that my academic record really dropped to a really bad level. The only consolation was that, being a badly behaved boy, I inevitably wound up in Saturday morning detention and spent 3 hours. The only good thing about it was you had to study, but you could choose what you studied. Mm-hmm. And inevitably, again, I chose maths as what I wanted to do. So I developed that way, although the rest of my education suffered quite badly. At the end of the second year, my parents got the results and decided it was time to end the situation and bring me back home. Because the situation had changed quite dramatically. So I came home at the end of second year, thinking I was going to have a Christmas holiday, when my mother took me in hand as a teacher, which, as you know, she was, and she brought me up to scratch over a 6 weeks period. And so instead of having a holiday, I had 6 weeks of grinding tuition. But it was better than that, because she not only taught me maths and things, but she also taught me about the family and the privilege that I had of being born into that family. And then again, she also taught me that I was a Queenslander. She looked at my birth, and to this day I still feel like I'm a Queenslander living in New South Wales.
That can't be right.
It is right. I mean, if cricket, for example, if Queensland plays New South Wales, I'm on Queensland side, egging them on, wanting to, which was a bad choice. I should have gone for the football side. I was always following St George at football, as you would have been aware, so naturally it was New South Wales at football, Queensland at cricket and tennis and swimming and other things. So I had a diverging situation there. So I lined up as a new student again at third year at Katoomba High School. And once again, it was once again it was a different school, a different situation, but you were still a new boy and you had to make your own way. But there was no real distinction as there had been at St Bernard's or at King's. You were just basically another student, but a new guy in, and you had to make your own way. And so anyway, I did reasonably well in third year and got my intermediate certificate and passed in all the subjects, and everything sort of came back fairly normal. I wasn't a brilliant student. It was a co-ed school, which was interesting, but the boys and the girls were separated, and because of the boarding house situation, life was different for me than it was for others. It had one great feature. In the guest house, you could eat whatever you liked. There was always a menu. You choose what you wanted, and you could eat from the kitchen outside normal hours too. So from the food viewpoint, it was great. But the really great thing was the guest house also came with a tennis court. And so far as sport is concerned, at King's I became a reasonable cricketer, and I went straight into the first grade cricket team for Katoomba High. An amazing thing was the reason that I made it was because I was an outstanding fieldsman. Tell you a little joke just to liven proceedings. Why did the Scarecrow get a cricket award?
Because he was outstanding in the field.
That's it. And that's why I was in the first grade cricket team. Because for enthusiasm, and a lot of people weren't enthusiastic, but the school had two high-class fast bowlers. And I was very good at catching, and I covered quite a period of the area, and if anybody spooned anything up, I was always there to take the catch. So I got in on fielding ability more so than on batting ability. But however, that was nice. But when I went on to tennis, initially, of course, I played my brother and sister, and at first we were just sort of learning the rudiments of the game, but out the back also we had a series of garages, and I used to be able to play along the concrete and playing against the wall, and gradually developed a game which was crude but effective. So over a period of time I developed into a very effective tennis player. I won the under-16 and under-19 Blue Mountains championships. I was unbeaten in school into tennis. And in fact, after 4 years, I could count on the fingers the number of people who'd ever beaten me. So I had been very effective, but obviously had no future because of my style. And the only great weapon I had was my service, which was a particularly nasty thing because it came down very accurately and very fast and had a peculiar bounce associated with it. So I could almost invariably win my serve against reasonable opposition. But at the end of the day, that was the end of it. Class-wise, I did relatively well there. I got my leaving certificate with 4 A's and 2 B's because of the way my career was supposed to be shaping. I was sort of looking to do the science classes, but invariably I came top in maths 1 and 2, and I got A passes there, and also in physics and history, and B passes in French and chemistry, I think it was. But I didn't learn that lesson, and I finally looked for a career more to do with my parents than desires rather than my own, what they thought would be a good thing for me to do. And so I settled on dentistry, which turned out to be a huge mistake. I was sent again at great expense to St Paul's College in the university, which was the Church of England college there. And I was aware of the fact that I was there at a huge cost to my parents, and I really studied very hard, doing a course that I didn't really have the ability to do. And whilst I got outstanding theoretical marks in terms of techniques and the ability to do things, and handle the precise things involved in dentistry,
Right.
it was obviously that was not going to work out. So after 2 years, I called it a day. It was obviously the wrong thing to do and came home. So I'd wasted 2 years, even though I'd worked excess. I would have worked about 60 hours as a student. And I guess one of the interesting things of being a freshman there, which you weren't through that, and I was situated near the telephones, and I was always breaking my study to answer the telephone and call somebody to the, which was very disruptive. But the good thing that I learned about it was developing my memory. And I think that was probably the big thing. And again, being a bit resilient. Their treatment of freshers was not good. What they did, your initiation ceremony consisted of being taken out with one other boy, blindfolded, and taken to the outskirts of Sydney at about 2 o'clock in the morning, and left to find your way home without any money and without any map or directions. But we did it. Needless to say, we broke a few laws by freeloading on public transport to get there. But we arrived back safe and sound. One boy, however, I think arrived about late afternoon the next day. So he didn't do too well out of the experience, but I survived, came back home, and then decided on probably what I should have done in the first instance, a career in business, and I took on studying accountancy. The great thing about it, I was able to do accountancy by correspondence rather than by going and attending lectures. That was good because it was a shortcut for me. I had to work during the day and study at night, and naturally I had an accounting assistant type of job in Sydney and studied for 4 hours every night, and then at the weekend I could go home.
So you stayed in Sydney, lived in Sydney during the week? During the week,
and went home for the weekends. That was the normal procedure. I could stay in over the weekends. The arrangement was there if I had to for some reason, but generally I went home. So far as private life was concerned, no girlfriends at all in Sydney. At the weekend, do what you like there, but still tennis was good. The other thing that I did was of interest was bushwalking.
Yes.
We had it, just a few of us were really taken on bushwalking, and we went at tremendous pace through the bush. We often passed people on about the third hour who'd been out for a day or two. And we used to sort of do a day walk from Katoomba right round to Wentworth Falls, over Mount Solitary and all the way around it. And we did that in a day. That was sort of the type of hike that we did, which was very strenuous, and you arrived back in a dilapidated condition. And Mother used to pick us up at Wentworth Falls after our day out.
So I assume your nickname at that stage wasn't Podge anymore?
Definitely not. I don't know, at school at Katoomba I actually had a nickname. I finally wound up as being captain of the school, probably because I was the least detested person in the class.
Well, always a good
but it was very good.
Now, I think you were telling us about
my
your
father.
Yeah.
I was always my father's son. He was great fun, and when I woke up in the morning as a little fellow, I'd head straight for my father's side of the bed. Have you ever wondered the origin of the story of Wire Whiskers, the pussycat?
Ah.
That came from him. But he was a wonderful person in just so many ways. We'd go to the pictures and we'd go to a musical comedy. He would come home and he had a baby grand piano and he would just sit down and play from memory the songs that we'd heard. And that to me was sort of incredible. No music, no notes, just that he'd heard it, memorised it, and could transmit it onto the keyboard just like that. Part of his life was being an entertainer at the guest house, and he was very good at that. And one of his great favourites always was Paddy McGinty's goat. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
Don't think so.
Well, Paddy McGinty's goat had a wondrous appetite. One day for breakfast he ate some dynamite. But he could just hold people enthralled. He could play anything and entertain people in so many different ways. He was very good at that. He was also a wonderful speaker. He had the ability just to hold an audience and capture them and hold them enthralled while he spoke to them. And he could motivate people as well at the same time. He was an astute businessman and obviously able to become mayor of the Blue Mountains and succeed in business in a variety of different ways. So I guess he was my inspiration in life, even though he kept me under tight control. I guess a strange situation. I never had any pocket money.
Right.
If I wanted anything, I had to go to Dad and explain why I wanted it, and it was always given, provided the story was good enough. So I always had the money to play tennis, for example, and that type of thing, or even to go to a high school dance, but it wasn't really possible under those circumstances to go off the rails, which was probably good. Girls didn't really enter into the equation very much. I only had two girls that I really liked and had a relationship with, but it was fleeting because one girl lived in Springwood and I lived at Katoomba, and then finally one sort of came and visited the Clarendon, so I was in Sydney and I was in Katoomba and she was in Sydney, so neither of them came to anything. I'd never really had a steady girlfriend. The girl that I did have my eye on in fifth year, she was really beautiful. In fact, the other girls just looked like boys by comparison. But unfortunately, her father was my French teacher, so that was going nowhere. So I finally, I didn't explain that I did my exams through the Public Accountants Registration Board, and I did it in 2 years. And it was the hardest course because at the end of it, you became a registered public accountant and you were entitled to practice in your own name. But the exams were very difficult because they were set by the practitioners, not by professional educators. And the pass rate in the first year was 10%, and the succeeding years 30%.
Right.
But nevertheless, I finished it in 2 years. And then from there, I went on and did the Chartered Institute of Secretaries exams and the Cost Institute exams, and finally I got first place in Australasia there. and that was the result of 6 months' work. So
Wow.
I was really working hard, but when you're doing things that you like, it seems to pass fairly quickly. And once I got my teeth into management accounting, that really established where I was going in my career and my life. Anyway, that brought study to a conclusion. I got a job with Wormel Brothers, and the interesting thing about that, or two interesting things about it. First of all, I had 3 jobs during my year with Wormels, but sandwiched in it was working for Herbert Adams, who was also a director of L.J. Hooker, and he was a superb businessman, and I learnt a lot from him. He was a great guiding influence to have. And then I applied for a position with BHP at the end towards the end of that term, and negotiated a position as a special accounting cadet. Based on my qualifications, my CV looked pretty good. And so then, after all that study, I'd been working 60 hours a week for 4 years. I said to my sister, it's time for holidays. Where can I go to meet lots of girls? And she said, go to Lord Howe Island. So there I was in Sydney waiting for the flying boat to come. It took off from Rose Bay, and they had a big hall there. And I looked over on the other side of the hall, and there was this wonderful looking girl, beautifully dressed. So I walked around the back and had a surreptitious look at her, and she was just as good as she looked from the distance. But unfortunately, she was also wearing an engagement ring. So I said, oh, that's the end of that one. So that's one out of the way. Let's see what else is going on. I got over to Lord Howe, and we got established at Pine Trees, the guest house over there, and there was just one girl, and she was it. And so I settled down to play tennis and hike and swim and do all the things that you're supposed to do. But I kept running into this girl, which was inevitable at carpet bowl, at table tennis, at tennis, and down at the church, and finally there was a dance, and I went to it. And suddenly it developed into a romance, or I suppose a solid friendship, I suppose, to begin with, or leading on to a romance. I noticed suddenly that the engagement ring was no longer there. And
was apparently, this during the stay at Lord Howe?
Yeah, well, apparently her mother had taken her there because she wasn't sure whether to go on with this relationship anyway. And so it became an item then, and I was, of course, going up to Newcastle. She was headed back towards Umina, and so it was necessary to, from my viewpoint, I realised I'd found the person that I wanted to spend the rest of my life with, and I wanted to make sure of that on the island, and so we really reached an understanding at that point. So I went up to Newcastle and spent the weekends down at her place at Umina, and we were married 12 months later at St Luke's at Concord, and so that was the story of that romance. And 62 years later, here we are.
Here we are. Yeah.
Still got a wonderful relationship, although not without its moments.
I don't think that's atypical.
No, it does not seem to be. But basically, any way you look at it, it's been 62 wonderful years. What I neglected to mention is while I was at Katoomba, another thing happened. I found I had 2 lifelong friends from the Katoomba days. Laurie Patterson and Murray Chapman. Laurie, unfortunately, died a number of years back. The peculiar thing is I had very strong relationships with both of them, but we never became a trio. Peculiar. I mean, they knew one another, but they never had a relationship really between them. They had relationships with other people, but they were two steadfast relationships. The relationship with Murray continues to this day. With Laurie, we'd often be in different states, but we would, with both of them, always meet once a year, one way or another, sometimes several times a year. It just sort of kept going. They were great relationships to have. So that's my basic life story until I met your mother.
Yeah, okay. One thing that I thought I remembered was that you'd said that and I guess there was jobs that you did while you were doing accountancy, but I thought you'd worked for Gadsden Hughes in Sydney.
I did, yes.
And then
came
to
back,
Newcastle.
Yeah.
And then
Yes, Gadsden
GHB
Hughes
and
was a period of time, I suppose, nearly 2 years there actually. And as that company developed, the accountant I worked for there became manager of one of the other enterprises, and they were looking for an accountant, and they sounded me out. And at that stage, the situation in Newcastle was a bit difficult. And so it was good to go to an accounting job back in Sydney.
Right.
And there was a lot to tell the story about that, but that's a work situation which might come up later if we have any more sessions.
Yes. Okay. So what about your recollections? I was intrigued when you told me recently that you didn't think you knew any of your grandparents.
Yeah.
And then later on realised that you had.
Yes, it was sort of strange, and it comes up in your notes too that you prepared. There was this lady that suddenly appeared with Clarendon had an annex called Villas Brett, and suddenly this lady just appeared as an ongoing resident at Villas Brett, somehow connected with my mother. And my mother said to me, "I want you to go and visit this lady and be nice to her." And
how old were you at this point?
At this point, I would have been in my early 20s.
Oh, okay. Really? Right.
Yeah. And I gladly did that because she was a really nice person, and we spent many happy hours together without my realising that she was my grandmother. And she was the only grandparent that I knew.
So there's no story around that, because she's this is Edith Bertha.
Yeah.
She's been living, or was living, as early as 1930 in Merriwa Street in Katoomba.
And I'd never been there.
Wow. That seems quite a mystery.
Well, I guess she must have got to the stage where she needed to be somewhere where she could be taken care of. And obviously the guest house was a good situation for her to go to. But many years later I discovered that she was my grandmother.
So it wasn't just a case of your mother assuming that you knew who she was?
Well, I don't know. It's just that she didn't explain it. It's strange but true.
Okay. I wonder if there's some deep mystery there that I guess we'll never know.
I don't think so. The relationship seemed to be pretty good, and obviously they'd both taken her in as being Mum's mother.
Yes.
And I don't think she lasted too long beyond that, so obviously she probably did really need looking after. But it's a strange story. I asked my good friend Murray Chapman, we're talking it all the time, and he talks about relatives. He got married 3 times in the course of his life. Speaking to him recently, I said, Murray, how many grandchildren have you got? And he said, I've got 13 grandchildren and 11 great-grandchildren. And I said, Murray, you're doing a lot against global warming. You've got 24 descendants. I've got 4 grandchildren. End of story.
Yes, it doesn't look like there are going to be too many great-grandchildren coming very quickly.
No, I think we'll be fortunate to see anybody.
Yeah. So your father was born in Balmain.
Yes.
And presumably his father had the printing business. And your mother was born in Broken Hill.
Yeah.
Along with Alice.
Yes.
Who was also born in Broken Hill. But there were previous children born in New Zealand. So he'd gone to New Zealand first.
That was my mother's family.
Yes.
So they came over, and John, or Jack as they called him, was the lad who stayed behind.
Right.
And he travelled over to Australia. The first I knew of his existence was when we suddenly got a parcel of New Zealand stamps commemorating the end of World War II.
Right.
I didn't even know I had a cousin in New Zealand.
Right.
Finally, he showed up, and he stayed with the various family members, including us. And we got to know him well, and then that's passed on. And his sons, Doug and Chris, are also like personal friends to me too. And the status at the moment there is that they've 2 sons, Kieran and the younger son, whose name I can't recollect at the moment, came to Australia, whereas the girl Julia stayed in New Zealand. Doug's daughter had 2 sons, and the sons seemed to disappear in different directions, one over to Canada and one somewhere else. I'm not quite sure where, but his daughter went to England, came back and married a guy, and they're now a resident at Drummoyne.
Yes.
But they're more your generation than mine, and I guess it works out that way. I go over there and see them occasionally when Doug and Karen come over. But our friendship is at that level, and not at the victorious level.
Yes, yeah. Well, we're sort of Facebook friends with Victoria.
Oh, very good.
And she seems to have taken to Kate. They seem to be more.
Oh, isn't
more
that
connected
wonderful?
Than,
I've been hoping that something like that would happen, because, particularly with Doug, I classify not as a cousin but as a personal friend. We just get on so well together. We've done trips together, and I'm hoping he'll sort of come over again, and we'll have a trip together after this virus situation that eases.
Yes. So do you know what it was that took your mother's parents to Broken Hill?
Yeah, the mining industry. They were engineering.
Right.
And that's where the links came up with, presumably with Charles O'Connor.
Ah, yes.
There seemed to be some sort of relationship there, but yes, he was an engineer somewhere in the mining industry in Broken Hill.
Okay. And then somehow or other, back to Sydney, and in 1925, your mother's a teacher in Rosebery.
Yes. Yes, I noticed that. It was something she never talked about very much, except that she was a teacher. I had a good, strong relationship with her sister, Alice, Auntie Alice, who was a lovely person. And even with Beverly, Beverly had a great relationship with her too.